Ladies and gentlemen, good day. My name is Rocco Romano. I've been teaching physics for over 30 years, and I'm going to talk about a case that actually happened, where I've seen how important the teaching of physics is. In fact, in a criminal trial, ignorance and/or bad knowledge of the laws of physics led a monocratic judge to issue a judgment based on erroneous physical conclusions. The relevant thing is that the monocratic judge was misled by a technical report prepared by an alleged expert, considered as such because an engineer. The technical report describes the physics of the alleged accident in a small page in which the technician, without writing any question and without making any calculation, expresses his opinions based on laws of physics often wrong or used in a completely wrong way. In the technical report, there are so many errors that it would be incredible if it were not for the fact that it's filed at the court of Nola, where the trial took place. I will briefly present the physical problem and its solution. Then I will describe the opinions of the technician, and I will highlight the principal errors present in the technical report, facts proper by the judge. Mr. D.S., defendant for slander, was accused of slander. He would have falsely accused his neighbor, Mr. O.P., offended person, of having caused him a damage for which he would have demanded undue compensation. An external plaster piece would have detached from Mr. O.P.'s property and would have reached Mr. D.S. in his garden, more than a meter away from the O.P.'s building facade. In the figure, we can see in scale the physical situation. From the building, 11.60 meters high, a piece of plaster would have detached, and it would have hit Mr. D.S. in his garden, more than 1.30 meters away. That day there was no wind, as established in trial by documentary evidence. Neglecting the friction with the air, conservative assumption, the alleged detached plaster would be subject only to the weight force. Equation 1 describes the motion of the plaster center of mass, that is where the plaster pieces may arrive, while equation 2 describes rotation about the plaster center of mass, and in particular tells us that the rotation speed remains constant. In order to establish if external plaster pieces might have reached Mr. D.S. in his garden, one has to consider only equation 1, which allows to estimate the distance that the plaster might have traveled. The detached plaster, subject to only the weight force, performs a projecting motion until it hits a ledge, cornice, placed about 80 cm below the detachment point. At the impact point, an unknown impulsive contact force, the reaction force of the ledge, will act. The collision between the plaster and the ledge is an inelastic collision and can be described by Newton's theory of coefficients of restitution. Immediately after the collision, the plaster is again subject to the weight force alone and performs a motion of the projectile with initial velocity determined by Newton's theory. If simulations are conducted with very conservative assumptions, it can be seen that the plaster makes a trajectory with a range such that it doesn't even reach the boundary wall between the palace and the garden, and therefore such that certainly the plaster could not have hit a person in the garden. Contrary to the physical solution, the technical report states that the external plaster pieces may have reached the garden of Mr. D.S. and they may have hit him. In the following, the contents of the technical report in quotes and in italic style, are reported. No equation is written in the technical report and no calculation is developed. According to the expert, it doesn't matter the height from which the plaster detaches, while the reaction force of the ledge is important. According to him, in fact, the action of this force, aging along the whole trajectory, determines a range such as to allow the fragments to reach the garden and to hit Mr. Diaz. Unfortunately, this force, like all reaction forces, is an unknown force, which has to be determined by the problem solution. In addition, it's a force of contact, acting only while the plaster is in contact with the ledge, and not along the entire trajectory. The technical report goes over. The reaction force is equal and opposite to the weight force, but it is applied in a point other than the barycenter of the plaster mass, and together with the weight force give rise to a couple. This couple gives the movement of the stone a rotary motion, and it is this couple of forces that determined the removal of the plaster until they reached the DS property. This opinion is completely erroneous. According to the technical report, the force due to the cornice and the weight force are a third law force pair, and therefore are equal in magnitude and opposite in direction. If this were the case, the resultant of the forces acting on the external plaster ledge would be zero, and therefore the plaster would have no acceleration. Evidently, the reaction force and weight force, both applied to the plaster, are not a third law force pair, because forces of third law force pair always act on different bodies. Furthermore, the reaction force is a contact force, acting only during the contact, while the weight force is an action at a distance force always acting, and so they cannot be equal and opposite. For the same reasons, these two forces cannot constitute a couple of forces, so that there is no torque acting on an external plaster piece during its motion. The reaction force has to be determined by the impulse theorem and by Newton's theory of restitution coefficient, and it's very different by the weight force. One can bring a stone on his head without injury, but if the stone is dropped by eye, it may make secret injury. In any case, a torque would determine a rotation motion around the center of mass, which would not result in an elongation of the trajectory of the center of mass. It's an opinion of the expert that the transformation of the potential energy into kinetic energy also gives the plaster an increase in forces and motion that allows them to reach even significant distances from the point of fall. It goes without saying that this opinion is completely wrong and devoid of any physical foundation. Forces determine the energy of a system and not the other way around. In the transformation of potential energy into kinetic energy, there is no increase in forces. The only force acting is the weight force, which is a conservative force, and therefore, for the conservation of mechanical energy, during the fall, the potential energy due to the weight force is transformed into kinetic energy, but the force remains the same. In this presentation, the case of a real trial in which a bad knowledge of physics laws led a monocratic judge to issue a judgment based on erroneous physical conclusions has been analyzed. The monocratic judge was misled by a technical report prepared by an alleged expert, an engineer. Essentially, in the technical report it's stated, mistakenly, that the horizontal range of the center of mass in a projectile motion is lengthened by the effects of a non-existent couple of forces, and by an additional force resulting from the continuous transformation of potential energy in kinetic energy. This real case shows how important the teaching of physics is, since an engineer and a judge, people who are supposed to be highly prepared and cultured, demonstrated to completely ignore its most elementary laws, with disastrous social consequences. In the city of Dante, the great poet, allow me to conclude this presentation with these verses. Che val perché ti racconciasse il freno Giustiniano se la sella è vuota, s'ansesso foga la vergogna meno. Thanks for your attention.